clerk please call the roll?
Mayor Porter?
I'm here.
Councilmember Oxton Lane? Councilmember Barry? Councilmember Clay? Here. Councilmember Ehrlich? Councilmember Siemens?
Present.
Councilmember Williams?
Here.
We have a quorum of the council, so we can proceed. I want to thank Irma for being our recorder for this evening. Thank you. I was going to say we have an additional agenda item on the agenda for this evening, which is a request from Councilmember Elrich for a item on the lengthening the comment period on the EIS for the ICC, and we will take that up as part of the special session agenda. Are there any council comments or announcements? Okay, I think I saw Terry's hand first.
Thank you, Mayor Porter. Last night, the Montgomery County Office of Human Rights presented awards and inducted new members into the county's Human Rights Hall of Fame. And I would just like to call attention to the fact that they inducted Mr. Lee Jordan. I'd like to congratulate his family on this great honor, and also thank Diana Cohn for recognizing this coming up and submitting Mr. Jordan's nomination. Later this year, in a couple of months, after the community center construction is completed, we will have a ceremony here in Takoma Park for the community to share with them the events of last evening. Thank you.
Yes, I would just like to let my colleagues know that it occurred to me that what I would like to do in the future is, as we consider requests by our residents for nomination to council-appointed committees or any commissions or any of those other kinds of things that we appoint residents to, that one of the criteria that I will be using for my own appointment and for voting for any appointments by any of my colleagues will be that I would like to check any of the lists that are now starting to be generated by staff for pointing out who owes things like stormwater fees or property taxes or personal property taxes. And I'm going to make it my own policy not to put forward an appointment and not to vote for anybody who owes the city any of those things. And I would urge my colleagues to consider that same step.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else?
Yes. First, I'd like to say, my Jesse, you've certainly changed since last week. You never know who's going to be sitting next to me here, but it's nice to see you. I'd just like to mention that Suzanne had sent around a disturbing email this morning about some pending legislation concerning immigrants in general, that the legislature is looking at. It's proposed legislation, and it basically would require local authorities to round up such people in a status of being an illegal immigrant. I think that this is wrong, and I hope that the city will fight it aggressively. I think it's wrong on the policy. This is a federal matter. It's not a local matter. And it's certainly wrong on the tactics. Certainly the police in this town, I hope, will never be put in a position where they will have to try to distinguish illegals from legal aliens. We certainly don't want our police force being used in this manner. It simply doesn't make any sense for the state of Maryland to pursue such legislation. There's no way that the local authorities can deal with this particular situation and this legal mandate if in fact it became law. So I hope the city will do everything in its power to fight this proposed legislation. It's bad for the state, bad for the country and certainly bad for our city.
And in fact, the city of Takoma Park has a law which prohibits our law enforcement authorities from cooperating with federal authorities in order to distinguish someone's immigration status or deport those without documentation. So that would be very consistent with our existing policy. What you said, not what the law would be, what the bill would be. I also wanted to say that Councilmember Austin Lane has let me know that she will not be able to be here this evening until approximately 9 o'clock. She hopes to join us for the discussion of council priorities, but she will not be able to be here before that time. Is there anything else? Okay. If not, the next item on the agenda is a public comment period. This is the time set aside for comments on items that are not on our special session agenda. And as I noted earlier, we have an additional item on our special session agenda, which would be the proposal to request extension of the comment period for the EIS on the ICC. Boy, isn't that a bunch of acronyms? The Environmental Impact Statement for the Inter-County Connector. But are there any comments on other items?
Yes, this is Mr. Pat Lovelace, 7620 Maple Avenue, Takoma Park. I got some updates for you people. We had a very interesting weekend this weekend for activism. You know, it's the 3rd anniversary of the war in Iraq. You know, we've lost almost, 2,400 troops now, or close to it. And we had a march from Mr. Cheney's house down Massachusetts Avenue to DuPont Circle for a good, well-spirited demonstration, but unfortunately we didn't have the numbers we needed. We need to get numbers out there and activists out there. And today, this morning, before 9 o'clock, we're out there by the Lincoln Memorial, and we marched down from there down to the Pentagon, where they had some people doing active civil, I call it civil obedience. You know, resisting the war machine and resisting the money that's being spent on it and resisting the loss of our health care because of it. Almost, over $250 billion now spent on the war machine. That's trillion with a T. And we had about 300 people down there marching on the Pentagon today, and I took part in both of those. Even though I was in a wheelchair, unable to walk right, I still took part in those. And I'd like to see more people out there. Second thing is, I want to make an announcement that Jamie Raskin, who's running for Senate, is going to be having a party over at Los Arrieros, and that's at 7926 Georgia Avenue in Silver Spring. That will be on Friday, March the 24th, from 6:30 p.m. until 10 p.m. He's going to be down there with Mr. Hightower, Jim Hightower. We're going to have a nice spirited fundraising. You know, he's doing work, a lot of work to stop the death penalty. He's doing a lot of work against the war. And if you want to come out and have a good time, come on out. You know, come on out and have a good time and be active. And mainly, we can't let fear of the war, fear of drugs, fear of our fellow human being put us in a bind. We got to stay out there and be active. We got to stand up for what Takoma Park was originally what originally stood for me. A city of peace, a city for the environment, and a city for social justice. We've got to do it. Everybody, man, woman, and child, got to stand up for it. Resist the abuse of the immigrants. Resist the abuse of the minority. Work for affordable housing. And above all, we've got to resist that war machine, which is taking all our money, all our resources, and all our young men's lives if we let it. You know, we've got to stop that. So come on out on the 24th, Mr. Jamie Raskin. I'll be there, and other people I hope will be there. Come on out. When we need people at a demonstration, come on out and put your feet where your vote counts. Come on. Come on out, everybody. Be active. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any other public comments?
My name is Mark Hessel. I've met many of you before. I'm an attorney, and I represent a variety of landlords in Takoma Park. I know the City Council has been spending many Monday evenings over this winter looking at rent stabilization issues, and there really wasn't much outreach to landlords. I found out about it only through a client who saw a posting in his building addressed to tenants to get involved. I am trying to get more landlords out. I know there's a public hearing scheduled for next week, and we'll have more landlords there to provide you with comments. But frankly, this is an issue which you really can't address in 3-minute snippets at a public hearing. And I think that without talking to landlords about what they're going through and the fact that renting property to individuals for housing in Takoma Park is no longer a viable enterprise. If you didn't buy your house, your building years ago and have nominal mortgage payments, you can't run in the black. That's why you're seeing some empty buildings. I know at least one building that's empty and a threat of a second rather large building that's probably about to go empty. You're seeing a lot more condo conversions, and the bottom line is Takoma Park is losing its entire rental housing stock because the business isn't viable. Affordable housing is a very admirable goal, but it's got to be done intelligently or you end up with nothing. If you just look at the prices of rental units being sold in Takoma Park and compare them to the income that can be generated in Takoma Park, they're completely out of whack, which should tell you that the people buying them don't intend to keep them as rental units. I know my time here is brief, and I don't want to get into the hardship petition issues, which are on the agenda for this evening, because I understand that's outside the bounds of these brief comments.
Well, no, you could make a comment on that if you wished.
Okay, yeah. Hardship petitions are based on a 1990 base year. That doesn't begin to compensate landlords for the fact that the rents have been controlled since 1980. And I know there have been some changes in the law, but basically they've been controlled pretty restrictively since 1980. And I know about a year or two ago, the last time I was in front of you all, and we were talking about rent control issues, there was a proposal floated. I think it was just a suggestion of something the council could look at, which involved changing the base year for hardship petitions to a more current year. If you do that, you stick the property owners with an additional decade or more of lack of relief. In the last few years, there's been very little increase in the cost of living index. That means that if somebody applies for a hardship petition based on...
Can you wind up your comments?
Yeah, it's going to be worthless. A last comment. It's called rent stabilization in the statute. It's really rent control now. It's changed over the last 25 years. I would challenge the council in enacting any legislation to, one, reach out to landlords, find out what's going on, and two, state a clear and specific public purpose.
And anyone who wishes to communicate with the council in writing is free to do that. We do accept public comments in writing also if you wish to cover more than you can in 3 minutes. Are there any other public comments? All right. Seeing none, we will move on to the city manager's report.
In regard to the community center, just a few items. As the council may have noticed on your way in, even though it was dark, there's lots of activity going on around the library. There's really two separate projects going on by two separate contractors. One is the library site work, which, as you may recall, was to improve some of the drainage around the library, and that work is being done under the auspices of TRG Construction. The other work basically is being done by another contractor. It has to do with replacing the soffits. The Public Works Director, Darrell Braithwaite, I think may have gone over this work with you a month or so ago when she brought the contract before the council. So that work is underway. I also wanted to follow up on an issue that had come up last week, as I had mentioned. In the very near future, the lobby outside of the council chamber will be closed to any type of access because of ongoing construction activities, and what that means is the elevator will also be unavailable for use. We had talked last week about moving any public meetings in the building out of this facility during that time period because of concerns about accessibility without the elevator, as well as the lack of handicapped accessible restrooms on this floor. There had been some discussion by the council about trying to explore different locations around the city. And what I wanted to report tonight is we have sort of zeroed in on the Takoma Park Middle School as basically the site for all three council meetings. In talking to the communications staff, they indicated that it would be challenging enough, if you will, to try to figure out how to do taping of the council meetings for subsequent broadcast on the city's cable channel in just an alternate location without having to kind of look at 3 different locations and how that would all work. So at this point, we have tentatively reserved the Takoma Park Middle School for the 3 council meetings that would take place during the affected time period of April 11th through May 5th. I just wanted to confirm so that we can move forward with appropriate public notification that the council is all right, which is basically focusing on the Takoma Park Middle School.
Ms. Matthews, you mentioned live telecast or recorded. I mean, it seems to me that for a 3-week period, a recorded rebroadcast would be fine.
Actually, that is, I'm sorry if I was unclear, Councilmember Siemens, that is what we're focusing on. Once we move outside of this council chamber, it's virtually impossible to do live broadcasts, so our intention would be to tape it and then rebroadcast it, at a subsequent time and date.
That sounds adequate. And then,
okay.
And as far as the exact location, I defer to your judgment on that.
I think the question, as it came up, and it was actually my suggestion, that we try and do it at different locations in the city so that people have access to the council meetings. In light, though, of the city manager's concern about making the broadcast as easy for people to get to as possible, I would agree with the issue about doing it at the middle school. Middle school actually is located very close to your ward, Councilmember Siemens, so it should enable some of your residents to participate, and I know they are actually closest one to this building too, but I know that we've received comments about making it accessible to people who are not just on Maple Avenue. I don't know about, it would not make it any more accessible towards 6, but it doesn't make it any worse, I don't think, in terms of
No, we had looked, besides the issues posed by the communication staff, we had also looked at some of the locations under the city's jurisdiction, including the New Hampshire Rec Center. Unfortunately, that was booked all the council meeting nights. We gave some thought to, I believe it was Councilmember Williams' suggestion about Takoma Tower. Obviously, there's our Victory Tower. There's some limited parking, visitor parking. So once again, with the limited public parking available, that might be difficult, if we did have a large crowd for some reason, because there's just such limited parking on site. So it doesn't sound like there's any major objection to just going ahead and proceeding with the use of the middle school for the council meetings. In talking to some of the staff, we do have a number of committee meetings that are taking place during that time. Because we really wouldn't need to get into moving furniture around for some of the smaller board and commission meetings. The board and commission meetings that are scheduled currently between April 11th and May 5th will be held in the senior room at the Computer Learning Center. So that would include, I believe, the Public Safety Committee is scheduled to meet during that time, Safe Roadways, Kultur potentially, are some of the boards and commissions. So we'll be making the necessary changes on the rolling agenda, as well as putting information on the website. 2 other items related to the community center, and then I know Councilmember Williams had something he wanted to report on the project. Some of the council has expressed some concerns or had some questions about various cracks in the concrete on the site. As I had indicated to the council via email, these were all items that had been noted previously and basically reported back to the contractor, just to try to get a sense of whether or not these are just sort of cosmetic issues or something that is of greater concern due to structural concerns. The city has retained the services of a structural engineer. That individual was on site earlier today, and we expect to get a report from him at some point in the near future. But I did just want to assure the council and assure the community that these were issues that had been noted, and we are taking the necessary steps to protect the city's interest if there are any problems. The last item, before I turn it over to Councilmember Williams, had to do with the scope of work to be performed by ECS. This is the company the city plans to retain to do the borings. As I had mentioned last week, we were in the final stages of putting the finishing touches on that proposal. I did receive that late last week. I will be executing that contract later this week, and then it will take approximately 3 to 4 weeks from the date that contract is executed until we receive their final report. Councilmember Williams, there was something you wanted to report on the auditorium.
Could I just follow up on that last item? You said 3 to 4 weeks to get the final report. Mm-hmm. Do you know when they would be out actually doing the borings?
I believe, Mayor, they indicated that it would take, bear with me 1 second. They basically indicated that they would be prepared to mobilize on the site within 1 to 2 weeks after receiving authorization to proceed, that they would be on site for about 2 days. Laboratory testing would take about 7.
Okay, and so you're saying 3 to 4 for the
That's what
final
they
report.
indicated, that from the time we give them authorization, it'd be anywhere from 3 to 4 weeks.
All right, thank you.
And I just wanted to provide an update on the previous thing that I mentioned where there was a meeting with the Arts and Humanities Commission and the Citizen Liaison Committee about trying to come up with a plan for some renovations to this room and dealing with the dais and the stage. And I just wanted to let people know that there was another meeting end of last week with somebody who will be providing information on a comprehensive look at how particularly sound could be improved in this room for multiple use. And we should be getting that report in the next week or so, and therefore have possibly have some options to look at for different funding that could include when we look at the budget.
Terry?
Thank you, Mayor Porter. Ms. Matthews, I had 2 questions unrelated really to any of the issues that you brought up, but I've been here at the community center numerous times on the weekends and in the evenings when we have 1 or 2 staff members here in the main lobby staffing the place, but there are no events scheduled. And I know that in the past we had talked about advertising the building would be open during certain hours, but the frequency with which I stopped in and found that there was actually nothing going on at the building, and yet we had 1 or 2 staff members here that we were paying. And some of these are a long time before the building's going to close and there's no more events scheduled for the evening. And I just wonder if maybe we shouldn't revisit the concept of leaving the building open to the public on that kind of a basis, because I think that we could make far better use of our staff dollars by having people staff this building when there are events going on, but not staffing it for an empty building.
Sure. I know there have been some events, Councilmember Siemens, and I don't know what time of day you've been here, that have been held kind of early afternoon on Saturdays. I believe there's a standing recreation program because I've been here. What I'd be happy to do is to touch base with the recreation director, get a sense of what programs are regularly scheduled on the weekends, and get a recommendation from her if we should be, not keeping the building open for later hours during the day in light of the concern that you stated.
I appreciate that. I think it makes, we constantly need to look at how best to spend our money, the public's money. The other question that I wanted to bring up, and that is with Hefner Park. I know the Ritchie Citizens Association, in fact it was Lee Jordan who helped to win the council's decision to build the Hefner Park many, many years ago. And it was for the Ritchie neighborhood. The Ritchie Citizens Association has met there for all the years since that building was constructed, and occasionally they have come down here to the municipal building to hold meetings here, and found that they had very low turnout when they do have their meetings down here at the this location. They were very upset to hear today that it is going to cost them money if they choose to continue to hold their meetings there at Hefner Park, and I would like to revisit that. I think that's inappropriate, since that is, the neighborhood recreation facility, and it is located right there where the neighbors live.
Certainly, I'm sure the mayor would be happy to schedule a more in-depth discussion of this issue, but just to kind of refresh the council's memory, I had sent out a communication probably 6 to 8 weeks ago about this matter. One of the challenges with using Hefner either in the evenings, but primarily also on the weekends, is that it is not obviously a staff facility. So if no one is available, then we actually need to have a staff member actually come in. There is a minimum call-in. I believe it's 2 hours, I think, for unionized employees to come in and basically open the building up. I think one of the policy decisions the council needs to make is when you are giving free space to a group, it's one thing to give free space, but does the council feel that basically there should be a hard cost associated with giving that space? I'm not going to pretend there's a right or wrong answer, but I think that's really what the issue is do you actually kind of go in the hole, if you will, to make that space available? As I had also indicated in that email to the council, I think the city had a practice in the past, which quite frankly we have discontinued, and I certainly do not recommend, of giving keys out to a city facility. Obviously, that poses a number of issues in terms of preserving the security of a building. Once you give keys out, you really have no idea of where that key is going or if copies are being made. Councilmember Austin Lane and I had a discussion just about the use of Hefner by an organization that she's familiar with, and one of the things that we may want to give some consideration to down the road is whether or not we could install some sort of swipe card system where someone could basically, access the building using a swipe card, but then the swipe card use could be terminated after that particular event. That is something we've given some thought to, but there's still some research to be done.
Thank you. I recall your emails and our previous discussion on this, and I think at that time I reminded you that I have in the past had a key to Hefner Park, and that's what Ritchie Citizens Association has used for access to the building, and I offered to continue that service if that would work out. I guess my frustration is we view ourselves as this small town in the big megalopolis, and I think there have been minor violations that I'm aware of in the past with the keys, but I don't think we've had any serious problems that I'm aware of at Hefner Park because I had a key that would let the Citizens Association in.
My comment was certainly not aimed at you, Councilmember Siemens, let me assure you.
But I would like to suggest that council members should have access to the building so that we wouldn't be able to provide it free to the neighborhood and also not incur those hard costs.
I think this is probably something that the council would need to discuss at more length, and I would be happy to set up an agenda item to do that.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Are we planning to discuss the use policy in April? Is that when you have it scheduled?
I believe it was actually originally scheduled to take place, I'm going off memory here, Councilmember Austin Lane, but I think it was scheduled tentatively for July so that we could basically have 6 months, a little bit past the budget season, get 6 full months of operation is my recollection of what was recorded in the minutes, but I'd be happy to verify that.
I'd appreciate it if we could discuss this particular use policy as soon as possible. I think the points Councilmember Siemens makes are ones that I would like to see the council discuss more in depth. And as far as groups being able to have access to Hefner, I really don't want to wait until July before we even talk about it, because then we'll have the August recess, and it's possible that that would keep Hefner out of circulation for a 6-month period or more.
Yeah, I'm sorry, you had asked about the broader community center use and rental policy that the council had agreed to revisit. I believe it was in July. I wasn't talking specifically about Hefner, but the council had made a prior decision to review the fees and those policies that were adopted last year. So I wasn't suggesting Councilmember Austin Lane it had to wait. I'm just saying that's when the broader discussion has been scheduled for.
I would be happy to put the specific discussion of Hefner. I think we can separate that out from the other discussions. We can put that on a sooner agenda.
There were actually 2 other items unrelated to the community center I wanted to report on. One is last week we had talked about scheduling a tour of the New Hampshire Avenue corridor. This was something Councilmember Berry had requested so that we'd have an opportunity to take Derek Berlage as well as the Economic Development Director for Montgomery County, make them a little bit more aware of what the council's vision is for the corridor. I had asked if the council could please let me know if you were interested in participating on that tour and any dates or times that would be particularly inconvenient for you. I would still greatly appreciate it if the council could get that information to me. We may need to make some alternative transportation arrangements depending on the level of interest. So if you could get some information to me in the next day or so, I'd appreciate it. The last item I just wanted to comment on has to do with the proposed relocation of Washington Adventist Hospital. I had notified the council by email earlier today that the hospital has postponed the filing of its certificate of need application. That was originally scheduled for April 14th, as you may recall. The hospital apparently does not have the appropriate control of the site that they are looking at in order to move forward with that filing. In talking to Jerry Stocks, they are still proceeding with their plans. This, in his opinion, should not be viewed as any indication that they do not plan to relocate. It's simply a matter of timing and getting all their ducks in a row. Under the current procedures for the certificate of need process, there is one date during a particular year at this time that someone can file. Unless that has changed or has changed at some point in the future, the hospital's next opportunity to file the certificate of need application would not be until 2007.
Yeah, just a quick follow-up on your prior item about Chairman Berlage. Don't forget that I had requested to possibly add the gazebo park to that agenda.
Yes, it's on my list.
Good,
Thank you.
thanks.
Okay. If there's nothing else, we'll go on to the next item, which is our special session agenda. As I mentioned earlier, we have one item listed on our agenda, and at the request of Councilmember Elrich, we put another item on the agenda. But let's start with the one that's listed on our agenda first, which is the resolution regarding state legislation to allow local governments to purchase and maintain their streetlights.
Good evening. We've discussed this briefly in talking about legislative priorities, and there has been action in Annapolis regarding this item. This is a proposal that was originated with the town of Kensington that would allow local governments to purchase street lighting equipment and then be the responsible party for maintaining them for a variety of purposes that are beneficial to municipalities. This has been passed by the Senate and has been heard in public hearing by the House. Action will likely take place later this week. This proposal would allow, well, right now local governments are not allowed to purchase street lights from the local utility, and this would allow that purchase to take place if the municipality so desired. Because we don't have any real control over this, we are restricted in the types of lamps, luminaires, and maintenance schedule that affect our street lights, and this is something that many residents complain about. And so some of the municipalities would like to have that kind of control to have more timely service and to get the kind of design and often energy efficiency that the community desires. The bills that are proposed are House Bill 1657 and Senate Bill 296. Control of the street lights still means that they have to be shared like they normally are. It's available as a public utility. And obviously the municipality doesn't have to purchase them if they don't want to, but it is an authorizing in the legislation. I'd like to point out that we've received an email from Catherine Tunis indicating that the Committee on the Environment is supportive of this legislation. And she indicates that the committee has seen opportunities to save both energy and money and to reduce CO2 emissions significantly through the use of more efficient street lights, and that they had in the past recommended being able to purchase street lights as a good alternative. So I did want to point that out to you. I don't think there's much more to discuss, but if you've got some questions.
Move.
Okay, it's been moved and
Thank
seconded.
you.
I'd like to point out a couple of things. I know that there's been some misunderstanding about what this item would involve, and I want to point out a couple of things. One is that this is enabling legislation. The piece of legislation that's going through the state would enable municipalities to do it, not require it. And before the city of Takoma Park undertook such a step, if this legislation should pass, we would do a complete analysis of the costs and benefits to the city. It isn't something that we would rush into, and of course we would have, as we always do, public comment and thoughts about this process if we were to go forward. And secondly, I'd like to point out that the folks in Kensington who originated this idea felt that this could be a large savings to municipalities that took up this authorization. And their estimate is that it could save the city of Takoma Park something like $67,000 a year in terms of ongoing maintenance costs. So the issue is one that is of interest to us. The enabling legislation would certainly enable us to take a look at it and to decide whether it was the right thing for us to do. But I think it opens an opportunity that would be very useful for us to have in our pocket in case we want to take a look at it.
It also does not, if I might, it doesn't mean that all streetlights have to be purchased, but it could mean that some are. And so there may be certain areas where you want something that fits in with a certain design scheme or something.
Yes.
It's best.
I appreciate that we have been provided this resolution. It's something I'm very interested in supporting. I appreciate Al Carr's leadership from the Kensington Town Council, and very happy to support this. I can point out from Ward 1 some issues with streetlights that make this legislation very important. On Holly Avenue, there was a lot of discussion by residents about replacing the older-looking style streetlights with Cobra Head style lights. And what the neighbors decided to ultimately do was wait until Pepco would provide an alternative, a style that they found fitting for their neighborhood, and then they would pay the difference between what the Cobra Head lights cost and what the ones that they desired cost. And that amounted to quite a lot of money. What was exciting about the neighbors eventually getting the lights that they desired was the energy efficiency of the fixture and the light bulb are such that they have fewer outages with those lights. So it is an added upfront expense, but then over time you see less maintenance costs. And something that we're experiencing all over Ward 1 is many streetlights out and Pepco taking a very long time to replace them. So I'm very pleased that this authorizing legislation is being considered, and I'm encouraging my colleagues to support this.
And just to follow up on that last point that Joy made, I spoke with the Vice President for Maryland Affairs of Pepco last week, and she provided some information that enables us to route all requests for streetlights that are out through her office, and she has a live person whose full-time job is to track those, and the hope is that there will be some improvement in the responsiveness to Pepco.
That's good.
From Pepco.
Right. One of the things I wanted to mention about the different kinds of fixtures and the maintenance contracts is that under this kind of a system, we wouldn't just be sticking with one supplier, and you can find a lower cost fixture sometimes in a design that you want. So that is one of the stated advantages of this bill.
Maybe the threat of competition will get some better services for us.
Couldn't make it worse.
Probably not. Two things. I was talking to people on the emails back and forth today, and then had a really good conversation with our very knowledgeable Public Works Director about a couple of the issues of concern. And one of them is that we actually have already purchased some of our streetlights, yet we don't own them because we give them the money, but they still belong to Pepco. And I think that could be an issue for us. Would we have to pay for those lights or not? And I know we would have to negotiate it, but it would be really great if the legislation up front says that any municipality that paid...
It's already paid for the lights.
Yeah, it's already paid for the light, doesn't have to pay for it twice. And the other thing is that, you know, there's nothing that says how much the lights could cost, and I wonder if it wouldn't be good to have some kind of a depreciation schedule so that you don't have to go, duke it out. Every municipality would have to go duke it out with them every time over what the light is. And they could say, well, this is how much it would cost to replace the light, and so this is what's going to cost you to buy it.
I'll bring those items up to the people who are sponsoring this, but as I mentioned, it's already been passed by the Senate. So my guess is that it's probably too late to make the refinements during this session. As we have some experience with it, perhaps in the next session or whatever, that could be tweaked. It talks about that the municipality would purchase the fixtures at fair market value. How that's determined is a big question.
Anything else? All right. Is there any public comments on this resolution supporting state legislation to allow local governments to purchase and maintain their streetlights? All right. I'm not seeing any public comments. The resolution is in front of the council. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? The resolution passes. The next item is the added item, and I wonder if Councilmember Elrich would like to introduce it.
The city has a long-standing position in opposition to the ICC, and the governor is now has gone through a fast-tracking process to try to speed up approval of the ICC. And in the fast-tracking process, the environmental concerns have kind of been given short shrift. And one of the things they were trying to do was get the approval and the work underway before the federal small particulate standards came out. Well, they missed the deadline, and they need to go back and they need to do a small particulate study. And it's kind of timely because Harvard Medical School just released a study that said there may be up to 70,000 deaths in the United States attributable to small particulate pollution. And the ICC, not only in itself is going to contribute to additional driving and additional pollution, but it actually makes some of the roads we're most concerned about, like the Beltway and all of the north-south roads, like Colesville Road and Hampshire Avenue, actually makes them worse. And that means that there's going to be even more small particulate pollution, not just from the ICC itself, but from the after effects. In addition, the state had trouble getting its appendices correct? Not appendixes, appendices correct. And people were unable to track the state's response to their comments during the comment period. You couldn't find stuff. You go into one of the appendix and you look around and you wouldn't find it. And so it's kind of hard to respond to what the state has finally done if you can't find the information. The state's just gone now and put out a revised document. What we're asking for basically is that the state extend the comment period until everybody gets the fine particulate study. We know what the data is related to the ICC, and then give people the full comment period on a document which is whole, it can be easily read, and has all the relevant data that people are supposed to consider. So I think this is pretty much just giving public as much access to information as they can have so they can make informed comments.
If I could make a comment, some of you actually saw the document. It's not just a document. It's a huge. Massive
stack.
And the appendices that Councilmember Eldridge is referring to refers to sections back in that from each of the different comments. So you do need to spend quite a lot of time flipping into these 3 large binders of information to determine what the response was. So it's not something that is a quick review, and I understand the concern about the time period.
And I would note that there's a timeliness to this, as the comment period is scheduled to end on Thursday, and so presumably it would have to be extended before Thursday. The council also received an email that had comments from the City of College Park and some other individuals also requesting extension of the comment period, and that's been provided to members of the council. And, if anyone from the public is interested, we could make copies of that for them also.
I was told that Chris Van Hollen is also going to make a similar request to extend the comment period.
One of the requesters here is Adrian Mandel, asking for an extension. So.
Did you move it, Mark?
Yes.
Second.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded.
Could I ask for a copy of it, please? Thank you.
So it's been moved and seconded. Is there any other council comments on this resolution.
I have a comment. I appreciate Greg Smith's bringing this to us. I think it is important for the public to have plenty of time to review the documents. I was pleased to obtain those documents last year for Greg Smith, and something that he and I found out was that public officials could receive these documents without charge, whereas members of the public could not and would be charged, and it's quite a hefty fee. So I'm assuming that there has not been sufficient time to review all of the appendices that have been mentioned, and I would support this extension of the public comment period.
I believe the city has a copy of this.
We have several copies. There's a copy on review, for review in the library. There's also computer discs, CDs of that. CDs are available for free from other libraries in Montgomery County. Not here, but at other libraries. And so residents can go in and get that. It is a little more awkward sometimes to work with the CD than with the documents, but it kind of depends on if you're looking at one thing or a variety of things, I guess. So there are some options to get it. It's also online, and so nevertheless, it's just a massive amount of information.
And my understanding is that some of the files are so huge, it's very difficult to download them. So, okay, it's been... Some of us, it's more difficult than others, I'm sure. Any other council comments on this resolution? Any public comments on the resolution? All right, the resolution is in front of the council. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? The resolution passes. All right, we are moving now to our work session, and the first item on our work session agenda, thank you, Suzanne. The first item on our work session agenda is a continued discussion of rent stabilization, and the topic that we are discussing this evening is the hardship rent increase petition.
Good evening. We thought we'd structure the presentation similar to what we've done with the capital improvement rent increase petition discussion in the past. Along those lines, what we'll be doing is giving you a brief overview of the current legislation in Takoma Park, a summary of some of the other options that are available, other ordinances that are considered by jurisdictions across the country, and then just a brief overview of some of the challenges and potential changes that we've identified at staff level based on our experience with the hardship rent increase petition process. I should note that, frankly, we haven't had a lot of applications for hardship petitions. The reason for that is unknown. We have a variety of theories, but basically we've had, what, 2 or 3 in the last 5 years?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's very limited. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Linda Walker, who will go through the requirements of the current ordinance.
Okay. Hardship petitions allow a landlord the opportunity to apply for a rent increase above the rent stabilization allowance if he or she can demonstrate that the net operating income in the base year is larger after adjusting for inflation than the net operating income in the petition year. The code identifies the base year as 1990 unless a landlord can show good cause as to why it should be a different year. So in other words, a landlord would have to show that the operating expenses have increased faster than the rental income. The code also identifies the net operating income as the actual income, including rents and other considerations. So that would include, for instance, laundry, parking, any kind of fees that they charge to the tenant, less the allowable operating expenses. So, for instance, if the necessary data is not available to the landlord for the base year, or if the base year is demonstrated to be inappropriate, possibly because the income for that particular year was either exceptionally high or exceptionally low as compared to the income for other years, then Kultur would allow the landlord to choose another base year. And they would choose to have the net operating income from a base year, possibly when rents were not under the rent stabilization allowance. The code does allow for that. For properties with 4 or fewer units, that would be 1987, because properties with 4 or fewer units came under rent stabilization in 1988. For other buildings, that year would be 1979. The 1990 year as a base year was, if I recall, chosen because it was that particular year where the city had most of the rent reports from all of the rental properties, and we could identify all of the actual rental incomes for the rental properties for that particular year. Colton may also allow the landlord to establish a base year net operating income by subtracting 60% of the landlord's base rent income, so that the net operating income is 40% of the rental income. So whatever base year is chosen by the landlord, he is required to submit 12 months of documentation to Kultur under the hardship petition. Expenses that can be included in a hardship petition are the cost of utilities, administrative expenses, management fees. If a landlord manages his or her own property, then the code does allow 6% of the rent income to be used as a figure that can be submitted in a hardship petition. Operating and maintenance expenses are also allowable in a hardship petition. Payroll, taxes, insurance, uncollected rent, and a vacancy loss. The loss can be no more than 5% of the rental income, unless a good cause can be shown by the landlord. And as well, capital improvements can also be filed under hardship petition. There is a particular segment of the code which allows a landlord to file a hardship petition if you have an adjustable rate mortgage and your interest rate has increased by more than 3% from the base year to the petition year. And the code does say, however, that in this circumstance, the increase that is allowed would be a surcharge that probably would be rolled back should the interest rate go back down. Expenses that cannot be included in a regular hardship petition are the cost of a mortgage, fines, damage paid to tenants, depreciation or other expenses recognized by the Internal Revenue but not by our code, late fees, lobbying fees, and no cost that has been reimbursed by a security deposit. So if there's a damage to a unit and the landlord has chosen to take a security deposit for the tenant, from the tenant for that damage, he cannot apply for an increase under the hardship petition for that particular item. Increases granted by Kultur under hardship petition include the rent stabilization allowance in effect at the time of the decision. That differs from the capital improvement petition. When the capital improvement decision is rendered, the landlord is allowed to take the rent stabilization allowance in addition to what Kultur allows for the capital improvement. Many of the owners that we have coming into the office today are inquiring about hardship petitions are the owners who have recently purchased rental properties in Takoma Park. And they have come to us when they consider the rents that are being charged are not covering for the cost of the operation of the property. So this seems to be primarily due to the high prices that they've been paying for the properties, the large mortgages that they have, Sometimes they've indicated that it's an increase in the utilities and what they see as the type of improvements they want to do to the property once they have purchased it. The filing process is similar to the capital improvement petition process. There's notification and a copy of the petition that goes out to the tenants right at the onset. Tenants do have the right to submit their written responses or their comments to COLTA. That information is forwarded on to the rents analyst. If either party files an objection to the preliminary administrative decision, which is written by our rents analyst, then COLTA can have a hearing on the matter. Following a COLTA hearing, if either party appeals the COLTA opinion in order, then that would go to the circuit court. Any questions?
There is a copy in your agenda packet of a PAD that was issued for the property owners at 777 Maple Avenue. That was one of the few hardship rent increase petitions that we've received.
It was also a fairly large property. It was like 130 units, wasn't it?
Yeah, it's probably a little more than that.
It's a fairly straightforward decision, frankly. But it gives you a better sense of what's taken into consideration when the rents analyst goes through and reviews the request for a hardship petition and what the net impact is on the tenants as well as the property owner. Are there any questions specifically about Takoma Park's ordinance as it applies to rent increase petitions?
I guess if you can speak just a little bit more about the decision about why 1990 is the base year. It sounds like it's solely because you have data for most of the buildings then, but if you had data for a building for prior years, say for 79 for a building that had been under rent control the whole time, that how difficult is it to pick that, to go to 79 instead of to 90?
Well, we've never had an application where they've chosen anything other than 1990, but maybe Mark has some recollection of why that date was chosen. I was always under the impression that because we had all the documentation on what the rental incomes were for that year on all the rental properties, that was the year that was chosen, why it was chosen.
That's part of the reason, but we came up with several options because we weren't trying to enshrine the year in stone. We were aware, for example, what Bruce is talking about, that somebody might have had a property prior to rent control, or they may have had a better year early on, and the intention was to allow them to pick whatever year was their best base year. We thought 90 would be a good date for people who didn't have records, or if there was uncertainty. So it wasn't, but it was meant to be sort of like a simplification. I think the previous code had also had a date in it, and we were trying to come up with something that was simple.
It was an earlier date.
An earlier date, and we decided it wasn't appropriate to use the earlier date because nobody was having records going back that far. But it is supposed to be flexible, and I hope it's treated as, if you come in and say you had a better base year, you get your best base year. We don't hold you to 1990. It's whatever year you had your best return is the year you get to use.
And
that's helpful.
And if you notice the example that we have here, they used 1997 as their base year. That I assume was their request because that's when they had their records from, was 1997.
But it's helpful to know there's some flexibility on that.
And so that would also be true if the owner had purchased the property after 1990, that they could use a year from when they had records.
They may not have records. There's also the rationale behind, I think, the 40% of net operating income is that we were told that was an industry standard, and so if nobody had any records that they wanted to use, they could use the industry standard. So we were trying to come at it from a number of different ways to provide staff with some flexibility in making the decision.
Okay. Industry standards. It looks like when I'm looking at the different numbers across the board that some of the cities use a base year rent, but then it looks like Washington, D.C. says 12% in the current year. So some statutes relate it to some base year that they pull out of midair, I guess, and or in our case, because we had data on it. And some of them relate it to current operating costs. How many of these groups do you know relate it to current operating income? Here I see Camden, New Jersey.
I think we haven't gotten to the comparisons yet. I don't know if the staff wanted to give us sort of a summary of the different cities.
We can do that now, and that's one of the most noticeable differences between them. If you can.
Just to make sure if the council has any other questions on what the city, which Takoma Park currently, not seeing any, why don't you just go on to and answer the question that Councilmember Clay had asked.
Councilmember Clay is referring to a matrix that I handed out right before the meeting, so you haven't had a chance to look at it much. But basically what we've done is set up a matrix very similar to the matrices you've seen in the past. Essentially, there are two different ways that people seem to accommodate landlords in terms of two different options that communities look at economic hardships and provide landlords with an opportunity to increase the rent to realize a fair rate of return on their investment.
Excuse me, Sarah, is this matrix available to the public also?
I've got copies up there.
Okay,
Yes.
thank you.
NOI, which is net operating income, is generally reflected as a percentage of your gross rental income. So whatever's left after you have calculated in your operating expenses, it's considered as a percentage of your overall rental income before you've deducted your expenses, and that's your NOI. And as Councilmember Clay pointed out, it ranges dramatically from 40% in Camden, New Jersey, up to 60% in Berkeley. Others, such as Santa Monica, tie it back to a specific base year, which is 1978. So if you had an NOI of 60% in 1978, that would be the NOI that you would be expected to realize throughout the course of the life of that particular property. If it was higher, it would be to your advantage. If it was lower, that would be the base year for the NOI. So again, it ranges from 40 to 60%, or whatever the NOI was for that particular base year. Most of the communities also provide for a historical comparison, and they seem to pick the year that rent stabilization or rent control was initially established within their communities. So many of them go back to the late 70s, 78, 79, when the ordinance were initially established. Takoma is the exception with the base year established at 1990. They also, such as Takoma Park provides for, set up a multi-tiered system. So as properties that were previously exempt from rent control or rent stabilization then become under the control or the regulations of the ordinance, that base year will float. So as Linda indicated in Takoma Park, prior to 1987, properties with fewer than 4 units were not subject to rent stabilization. They came on board in 1988, so their base year, their determining year as far as what their net operating income would be 1987, and that's true pretty much across the board with all of the jurisdictions. Alternatively, Camden, which is a little different than the others, looks at just the petition year. So if I were a landlord and I were to apply for a hardship petition, I would submit my information for 2005. And if my net operating income was less than 40%, I would then be entitled to an economic hardship surcharge. I could also elect to go through and verify what my net operating income was for the past 3 years, take the average of that, and if my net operating income year in 2005, or my petition year, was less than that 3-year average, I would then qualify for a hardship rent increase. Does that make sense? It all makes sense, right? The thing about Camden is, however, that they look at it on an annual basis and review it or reevaluate it. So it's a floating thing. In the other communities, it's basically fixed. So if your NOI in 2005 is less than it was in 1990 in Takoma Park, you would get your rent increase, and that would remain in place until such point in time that perhaps you needed to apply for another economic hardship petition, or you did a capital improvements petition, et cetera. Across the board, with the exception of Camden, the communities allow some flexibility in that the landlord can request that an alternative base year be established. And as Linda indicated, that could be because their operating expenses were exceptionally low for some reason. It might be just the timing of the utility bills or the property taxes, or their net operating income was quite high because they received deferred income for one reason or another. The exception to the NOI is in Washington, D.C., where they look at the rate of return. And basically, that's a percentage of your operating profit divided by your net worth. And they have an expectation that a reasonable rate of return is 12% of your investment. If you have less than 12% of your investment, then you would qualify for a hardship increase. If I understand correctly, that is one aspect of their local ordinances that is under review right now in the district. And frankly, there haven't been a lot of recent conversations about it, but we'll provide you updates as that information becomes available. The one thing that is common throughout all of the jurisdiction is that it's very infrequently applied for. Linda's been contacting various counterparts across the country, and very few of them actually get hardship or hardship-related increase or petitions. One of the rationales maybe for that, one of the rationales for that may be that in most of the jurisdictions that are included in the matrix, there's an opportunity there for vacancy decontrol. So that if the unit is voluntarily vacated by the tenant, the landlord has an opportunity to bring the rent up to the market rate, and then they are, again, subject to rent stabilization or rent control standards. That would have an impact on the frequency of the hardship rent increase petitions. The other mitigating factor may be that many of the communities provide for surcharges. If you go through and you look at related surcharges and petitions, which is the fourth column over, many of the things that you can apply for a surcharge above and beyond the annual rent increase allowance relate to operating expenses, which we've all personally are aware of the fact that they fluctuate. It could be your property taxes. Some communities allow for a surcharge and increases in insurance, heating, fuel, water and sewer rates, a variety of things which would have a net impact on your net operating income. So with the combination of the vacancy decontrol and the various surcharges that are opportunities that are available, that could explain why you don't see a whole lot of hardship rent increase petitions. Takoma Park, we have the option we have that, or the closest thing we have to vacancy decontrol would be allowing a landlord to increase the rent to the maximum allowable rent upon the vacancy of a particular unit. It's not quite the same, but that would be the one possible comparable. Are there any questions about the other communities? Colton?
So when I look at this, it seems to me like there are three components that are really important to creating a hardship for landlords over the long term. And that is, I think, how you regulate profitability. And it seems like it would be, obviously, the less the percentage is, the tighter that would be for a landlord. And I would think also that if you tied your net operating income figures to a base year, that's probably less valuable than a net operating income that's tied to a current year, especially if a property had changed hands and the cost of the mortgage would change hands, and presumably that would go up. And so that would be in my mind, more onerous to have a base year that's the net operating income that's tied to a base year. And then the other thing is, what is the percentage of the annual allowance, and what is it based on? And there's some that are 100%. Berkeley is 65%. We're at 70%. And obviously, the closer you were to 100% of the consumer price index, the less of a squeeze that would be over the long term. And then the third one is whether or not there's vacancy decontrol, which is basically to reset the rent to the market rate when a unit becomes vacant. And so when I look at all of these, it seems like Takoma Park is the only one that has this kind of triple whammy effect, where we tie our net operating income to a base year, and we don't allow for rents to be reset when there's a vacancy, and we tie the annual allowance to only 70% of the consumer price index, which, if you times that by the number of years that that's been in effect, is that about 25 years? Someone have a calculator? What's 65 to the, or to 70 to the 25th power? What would that ultimately be over the 20? Do we know what we've really given people? Because 65% of 60, yeah, that would be interesting to see whatever 70% of the 25th power is.
It wasn't, that particular rule has not been effective for 25 years. That one only goes back for
92.
92. So it's, how many years is that? 18,
14.
14 years. So it would be 70 to the 14 time. That's really, that's the most surprising thing to me about reading this.
It is interesting, isn't it?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's really tight for folks. The thing that I'm concerned about is that it seems to me like the effect would be, if you were a landlord and that's what you're looking at for a return on investment, here's the other interesting thing, is it seems to me strange that you would find somebody that you would buy your property, yet in fact people do buy properties. Properties sell like hotcakes in Takoma Park, which of course begs the question is, are people buying these with the ultimate intention to convert them to condominiums, which is an effect that we really want to avoid? Are our restrictions so tight that we're encouraging that?
But this has been going on forever. I mean, and the property has been able to be sold forever. So this condo thing is happening in Montgomery County that has none of these restrictions. It's happening all over the place. I mean, to say that this is happening because of rent control ignores the fact that it's happening in Montgomery County with a vengeance where there is no rent control.
I think those are two different phenomena. So.
Well, it's hard to say that this is the cause of the problem when frankly, it doesn't make sense to rent, but it also doesn't make sense at any level. There's no rent increase that you can give that makes it worthwhile to stay in the rent business when you can buy a unit like the ones we know about, for example, 641 Houston, where a guy could buy the unit for $25,000 a unit and turn around and, this is 2 years ago, mind you, and turn around and sell them unrehabbed for $135,000 a unit. At $110,000 a unit in 1 year, you couldn't make that profit in a lifetime on the entire building. It would take you forever to make that kind of money. So raising the rents another $200 would not change the economic equation there. It still makes more sense to sell the buildings. So I don't see this as that's a problem, and I prefer legislation that restricted condo conversions if that's the thing we want to restrict. I mean, buildings in Takoma Park have always been sold. People continue to do business here. I'm assuming they must be doing okay. And if the combination of the 70% was really a problem, they've got the hardship petition. They're not coming in and saying this isn't working, I want to use a hardship petition.
Because it's set to a base year of 1990 at 40% of the rental income.
But we're not holding them to the base year. We're saying take your best year. You don't help at a base year. No one's held to 1990. The purpose of it was 1990 was the year we had data for. You come in and show any other year where you made good money, better money, then you get to use that year. I mean, we had this discussion when we set the 1990 year, and we understood we could not constrain people to a single year. That 1990 might not be their best year. So our response was to be flexible and say, you pick your best year, or you use the industry standard. You do one of those two things.
Well, how about the industry standard for 2006?
For net operating income?
Sure.
I don't know.
That's what other people are doing. They're saying 40% now.
But we're saying 40%.
No, we're saying 40% of 1990.
That's what you got then. I mean, it seems to me that you're asking for something which is going to open the door for massive rent increases. If I say now in an overheated market where people have taken apartments in Silver Spring that not so long ago rented at $800 or $900 and can get $1,400, I guess their profitability is going to be way up in the stratosphere. And if the units here are measured against that kind of profitability, and that's what we have to allow people to get because that's what the market says, then the affordability of these units is toast. They won't stay affordable. I mean, we either make a commitment to try to preserve the units, or we say we don't care what happens to these units. We don't care that there's not a supply being created. Just let the thing go. I mean, it is sort of a fundamental decision. I'm just not on the side of letting things go. I mean, there's no place for folks to go. I mean, I saw somebody's rent slip for a student in my school, and it's an apartment on it's the red brick apartments on Piney Branch Road. Not the most appealing apartments in the area. $1,368 for a two-bedroom apartment. I mean, you consider the number of families who are living in there on assistance and paying almost their entire incomes in order to try to stay there. I don't think that's a particularly good thing. I'm not interested in seeing, Takoma Park go that way where people can make the choice of spending 50 or 60% of their income to stay here or leave. Because there's an enormous difference between those apartments and the price of apartments in Takoma Park. And those apartments aren't better. In many cases, those apartments are worse. So they're paying more money for worse conditions because there are so few places for them to go. I mean, to me, Bruce asked the question, I guess 2 weeks ago. He said, sometimes you wonder why we're doing this. And I really do think that the ultimate reason's a moral reason. I mean, it's not economics. It's that if you've got people and you don't have enough housing for them, and it matters to you whether or not they get to have a roof over their head and they're in a decent community and they don't spend every penny they have on rent, then what we're doing is the right thing. And I don't look at it as an economic argument. I look at it as a justice argument for people.
Well, I don't think we can make our policy decisions and not consider economic factors. I think it's difficult to use anecdotal evidence, for one thing. I think it would help us if we had an actual study that would tell us what was going on. But you say this has been going on for a long time. Yeah, but we're getting more and more people who are converting. We've got a 40-unit building that we just got notice of. There's 40 units that we just got notice of that's now standing vacant in your ward. We've got the threat of a building 5 times that size to vacate, which is a significant threat. And, to lose that housing, I think it would be worse for people to have no housing or not to be able to purchase housing when we're losing that much of the rental stock.
But those people will have no housing.
Yeah.
That's the net effect.
Yeah, they're going to have no housing.
Well, they're going to have no housing if you let the rents go to market.
No.
If you take the rents up in that building, as that landlord suggested, 25%, those people are toast.
If you remove the vacancy control, you would not affect a single current Takoma Park resident, and you would give some funds to landlords that, as some people moved in at market rate, then that could be used to provide more support for their overall business. But in any case, we have.
They're not starving.
Well, but the problem with vacancy decontrol is that over time you lose all your affordable housing. It goes.
you reset the rates, you certainly wouldn't have affordable housing that had been set in 1980 or 1980 when, or 1990 when those rates were set, basically, and we've had 70%.
For most of the units, it's, no, in the 70%, I think it's important to note that the 70% of the Consumer Price Index was selected because the data that we had was that 30% of a landlord's expenses were financing expenses, and those don't change over time, except they go down. So it didn't make sense to follow those. Now, the point has been made, and I think it's a good point, that maybe if we're going to use that percentage, we should apply it to a different base. And I'm certainly willing to look at that, and I think that might be a reasonable thing to do. It's also been suggested that we might want to allow increases for things like utility costs when the tenants aren't paying that. And I think that's a good point also. But I don't think you can say, well, you know, we're only giving 70%, and therefore people aren't able to cover their costs. The costs that increase should be covered by the 70%, because the financing costs aren't going to increase on an annual basis.
I mean, you will wind up with a total loss of units. You turn these units over, and at those rents, people are going to be gone. With a state that allows no-cause eviction, where you just have to say at the end of the year, I'm not renewing your lease. Why would I renew anybody's lease, knowing that just by simply not renewing and not retaliating, I get a unit at market rate? I mean, it's...
Well, you can set the rules so that only a voluntarily vacated unit gets to be reset.
But tenants can tell you all kinds of ways that they're going to be pushed out of units. I mean, and it's not anecdotal, Colleen. I mean, the COG did a study that compared our rents, and they actually listed out Takoma Park this time from Montgomery County, and the COG study says that our rents are hundreds of dollars lower. Now, the same study that was done not so many years ago, I want to say less than 5 years ago, when the Silver Spring market had softened, showed that the spread between Takoma Park rents and Silver Spring rents had narrowed greatly, and that if landlords were able to take the maximum rent, had chosen to take the maximum rents municipal, they would have been very close to the Silver Spring rents. But the market in Silver Spring was soft then. But as soon as the markets heated up in Silver Spring, and tenants in Silver Spring got 10 and 20% rent increases, the difference between Silver Spring rents and Takoma Park rents broke wide open again. But because they're getting that much and they can do that in Silver Spring, doesn't mean it's the right thing to let people do here. These folks aren't in a position to be able to pay rent increases like that. I was at an apartment complex in Castlegate up on Route 29. People's rents were going from $8.75 to $13.75.
You haven't heard me advocate for that, though.
Can I make a suggestion? We're getting a bit afield from the hardship petition discussion. Let's have a couple more comments and then.
But I think it's actually the more interesting discussion to have.
Right, but what we said we would do initially is we would go through the details of rent stabilization.
Right,
and once we gave staff guidance on that, we would have this larger discussion, which we will have. But, you know, we also need to give staff something to work on in providing us with revisions to the statute.
And I think it's helpful to go through all of these different pieces so that all of us currently on the council begin to start to have some of the understanding of our current law that some of the people who were around when it was implemented have from that history. I just want to make two quick points that, Mark, I think I would agree with you in wanting to protect people, in wanting to keep affordable housing for people. I don't think anybody's against that. I think the difficulty that I have with our law is that we essentially have a kind of a public purpose that ends up, the cost of which is borne by the people who are providing the housing. And I'm not sure that we should be kind of shifting that burden for that public good so much to them. And I think that the other difficulty is that our way of doing it is so complicated and getting into so many formulas and so much, you know, picking what base year and what percentage and what the percentage is based on, and whether it's clear to people that they do have the flexibility on the base year on something like the hardship petition. It can become so overwhelming to deal with all of that and understand all of that, that I would imagine that a lot of people kind of throw up their hands and say, I'm not going to deal with it. So I think my 2 cents at this point in the discussion is that as we go through all of this and get a better understanding of it, anything that will enable us to clarify and simplify what we end up with would be helpful.
Terry?
Thank you, Mayor Porter. I don't yet have 2 cents for this discussion, but I do really appreciate your doing this briefing on our current law. It's been very helpful to me. With the mayor's indulgence, I would like to follow up with Councilmember Clay's comments and just make sure I understand exactly what you were talking about, because I think as was said during the public comment session, this is more than a 3-minute discussion. We need to really have these more in-depth discussions so that we can craft any changes that would be the best for the city and the city residents. But Councilmember Clay, what I heard in your suggestion was that there would be no, if there were any vacancy decontrol, what you were suggesting is there would be no impact on or rent increases for existing tenants?
If we just remove the vacancy control provision, yes, it would provide some additional funding for people to put into their units and landlords, and it wouldn't affect current tenants. It wouldn't affect a single current resident of the city.
Okay. Assuming that we solve the problem on that Councilmember Elrich brought up about the fact that tenants are not always have control over whether they leave their apartments, that their lease is not renewed and they're told they must vacate with no cause after 1 year. Right? So that adds a little complication.
Yeah, well, you can only allow a reset when the units are vacated on a voluntary basis.
And then just one other question for what you were suggesting is you were saying
and the landlord returns their security deposit.
You were suggesting going to whatever market rate is at the time, but I would couldn't there also be some other formula that would adjust the rate allowable rental upwards, but not necessarily to market rate?
Yeah, I suppose you could do that. I think my point is that when you look at the criteria that they gave us on the chart and what criteria and the ones that are the most restrictive, it seemed to me like there were 3 components that could actually, I think, actually create a hardship, and that is how you do this net operating income, whether or not you allow rents to be reset at some time in some way, and what is the amount that you allow the annual increases. And so for us, it's 70%. So the cumulative effect of that over time, when it's 70% of 70% of 70%, that changes it over time. And also, I think that the critical one related to the condo conversion is that the net operating income figure is tied to a base year, and I take the mayor's point that was set that way with the thought that the financing costs wouldn't increase and the mortgage would stay stable, but land values go up, and so if somebody comes along and purchases that, you have to pay more for the land, even if you, as a business person, evaluate and say, okay, I can only get this much rent. Ultimately that land has a value, and I think in this case it is encouraging speculation and conversion into income.
I'll conclude with just that I think what this highlights to me in this discussion is that we need to after getting these briefings, that we really need to talk about what are our goals, what is it that we want to accomplish before we move into crafting solutions, because I hear some good ideas on, from various council members, and yet it seems like they're shooting at different targets. So
Yes,
I think
as I've said before, it is my intention to provide an opportunity for the council to discuss the larger issues. But I think it is useful for the same reason that Bruce mentioned. I think it's useful for the council to go through these individual discussions. Actually, I have a suggestion on the hardship petition topic. I'm sort of intrigued by the notion of what Camden is doing and what Berkeley's doing a variation on, and I wonder if we could take a look at that, which is instead of hinging it to actual expenses, to setting a percentage net operating income target and sort of comparing it to that. That seems to me in some sense a cruder way of doing it, but it might be a simpler way of doing it. I just don't have a sense of what the impacts would be if we went to something like that. Do you all have a sense of what that would do?
We can go through the hardship rent increase petition that was in the packet and see what the impact is. We can go through and
we don't for most buildings in the city. We know what rents are.
Yes,
but we don't know what their operating expenses are. So we wouldn't know what sort of the typical, I mean, we did, as Mark said, get, information on what sort of the industry average or the industry assumption or the industry rule of thumb was. But I don't think we had never had the data, and I don't believe we do now, to look at actual net operating incomes of the buildings in the city.
We've had a couple of meetings ago, we shared with you some information about a fairly new landlord who was losing, who would be a good candidate for a hardship petition. We can go through her numbers and see what the net impact would be. Based on just a quick analysis of it, she wouldn't necessarily have qualified for a hardship petition because her primary costs were in new mortgage for the property that she bought. There are a couple of other sort of challenges with the current ordinance that I'd like Ken to just go over really quickly with you that you haven't identified in your discussion, if you don't mind a couple of minutes. But we can go through and see what we come up with if we play with some of the examples we've got.
And these are just based on experience with the existing law. One problem is that the hardship petition process undermines the anti-gentrification provisions of the capital improvement process because it doesn't, it allows landlords to include as hardship expenses the cost of, the amortized cost of capital improvements, and it doesn't limit that to capital improvements for which they could get a capital improvement rent increase. So the
why doesn't it?
Pardon me?
Why doesn't it? I don't remember writing it in the way that it would be different. That wasn't the intention when we wrote it.
No, I'm sure that wasn't the intent, but that's definitely the way that it works.
Is it because of the difficulty in distinguishing between capital improvements that would be allowable and the ones would not be?
It's because the code defines a capital improvement as addition of labor or materials to a property with a cost of $200 or more. And then it goes on to, in a separate section, say which capital improvements entitle a landlord to a rent increase. And those are only maintenance-type improvements. But that limitation is not present in the capital improvement or in the hardship petition portion of the code.
Okay.
So that's definitely something that we would want to fix.
Okay.
To date, I don't think that it leads people to intentionally, make improvements with the expectation of getting a hardship petition, but it definitely can lead to higher rent increases than council probably intended.
Okay.
I have a question about the number of these that we've gotten. Did someone say that it was 2 over the last 5 years?
It's about 4.
4?
Yeah.
Very few. Very few.
Yeah, we had about,
Since 92.
yeah.
4
Four
since,
since 1992.
so over the last 14 years, we've had 4. And did we approve them or no?
They were all.
They were all approved.
Not in its entirety.
So
If you
partially.
recall with the capital improvement petition examples, some of the improvements were approved, others were denied. The same is true of the hardship petition.
Ken, have you seen this kind of double application? Is that what you would call it?
When it came to my attention, it was in a case, I think some of the council might be familiar with it, involving installation of air conditioners. And, it was Colton's position that the air conditioners should not entitle the landlord to a rent increase, but the court disagreed and said they did. But in that situation, had the court said no, those air conditioners should not result in capital improvement increase, they still would have resulted in a hardship petition increase. One other issue that I'm concerned about is that there's always a lag time between when a capital improvement is installed and when a hardship or a capital improvement petition rent increase is granted and then collected. And the way the hardship petition process is set up, the income from a capital improvement petition should offset the expense and really kind of zero out. But if there's a delay and the landlord doesn't collect the capital improvement increase during the petition year, then it can result in them essentially getting kind of a double increase for those improvements for which they've already filed a rent increase petition, capital improvement petition.
But those both sound like things that could be fixed in the law, and I assume that you have recommendations to us to do that.
Yes,
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, for the most part, it's a simple matter of only allowing capital improvement expenses, only allowing them to be counted as hardship expenses if they've been granted and started collecting a capital improvement rent increase.
Okay. All right. Is there anything else that the council would like to mention to the staff in terms of following up on these things?
Linda reminded me that the city of Berkeley and the city of Santa Monica have both done reports on the impact of decontrol on the affordability of the properties within their jurisdictions. There was a state law that was enacted in the late 90s that sort of mandated decontrol upon voluntary vacancy. So the data is fairly current. And if you're interested, we can make that available to you.
I think that would be helpful.
That was 1999. They
Right.
did that.
Okay. Is there anything else that you need from us on this topic? I think you've heard some discussion. I'm not sure how much of it is directed to hardship petitions, but I had one thought that I'd like you to follow up on in terms of looking at the impact of that.
Yeah, we'll give that a shot.
Okay. Anything else that people would, Bruce?
Yeah.
Just a general comment that I appreciate the amount of effort you've put into providing us with information and the thoughtful comparisons that you've made and your ability to kind of answer our questions on the fly. It's been very helpful.
Yes, the comparisons of the jurisdictions are very interesting and very detailed and useful. And I wish Mark was here, and I'd certainly say it to him while he was sitting there, that while social justice is a noble and fine goal, well, here he comes, I can't imagine a place like Berkeley, California, not having that as one of their goals. But at the same time, they also have a very detailed system for arriving at a fair and reasonable standard for both the landlords and the tenants. And so it really behooves us to embrace the social justice as a goal for the community, but also to look at the fine points of these different jurisdictions and what they've done.
I just want to say something about Berkeley and Massachusetts. Both those states, the landlord interests, basically crushed the tenants in the state legislature. Berkeley didn't change its law. Santa Monica didn't change its law. Boston and Cambridge didn't change their laws because of pressure from the tenants or the indigenous community, the people who lived there, to change the laws. They changed the law because the state legislature constricted what local jurisdictions were doing the rent control laws, because the money interests had a lot more power in the state legislature than they frankly had in Berkeley, where they had in Santa Monica. And so what they couldn't get done with the councils in Berkeley and Santa Monica, they got done with the money they rolled into the state legislature. That's what happened in California, and it's what happened in Massachusetts. We don't have that here at this point. I mean, none of us run campaigns that require those kind of campaign contributions that we're subject to those kind of money pressures. But, you know, this is different. Like, you shouldn't look at what the other jurisdictions have done necessarily and say, oh, this is what they did because they wanted to. I mean, people in Berkeley and Santa Monica on the council are not happy with what the state legislature did until.
Okay. And I also, but I do want to second Doug's comment, thanking you all for the amount of work that you've done and the comparison charts and the various analytical pieces that you've given us. My rent stabilization folder is getting very fat at this point, and I think it's all very useful and will help us sort of find our way through a very complicated issue, and hopefully to a way that's easier for both landlords and for tenants. So thank you for all the work that you've done. And I know that there's, what were you going to say?
I was just going to remind everyone that there will be a public hearing.
Yes.
That's been scheduled for next Monday, March 27th, if I understand correctly.
Yes.
Where you'll have an opportunity to hear from the tenants and the landlords and others that have an opinion or position on rent stabilization. We have posted it on the city's website, on the calendar, the notice board. It's gone out on the listservs. There will be a mailing tomorrow to the tenant associations and the landlords and other groups that have expressed an interest in this. And there will also be a notice in the newsletter that I believe will be published hopefully before the 27th.
Right, and our community organizers will be going out to buildings to distribute flyers as well this week.
I thank you for the reminder. I'll bring a lunch.
And there will also be further council discussions of sort of the goals and the purposes behind rent stabilization, sort of the overall discussion, as well as there'll be a discussion when you come back to us with your proposals for changes in the law, and then there will be, in addition to that, discussions on whatever changes the council chooses to make in the statute. It will go through 2 readings as council changes in law always do. So there will be a number of times that people can come and make comments on what we're doing. And as was mentioned, the first time is next week. Thank you all.
Thank you.
The council will take a brief recess and come back for the final item on our work session agenda. final item on the council's work session agenda this evening is a follow-up discussion to the discussion we had a few weeks back on council priorities. I'd like to turn it over to the city manager for her to sort of give us an introduction.
Yes, when the council held its work session on January 30th, the staff had proposed a work plan to address 5 major policy areas that we had identified based on prior discussions by the council. Those 5 areas were affordable housing, the community center project, redevelopment of the New Hampshire Avenue corridor, development in other areas of the city, and tax duplication. As part of the discussion on January 30th, the staff had presented the council with a proposed work plan to advance the city's progress in each of those areas, and a copy of the work plans that were presented to the council on that date are included as part of the agenda packet. I would note that in a few instances there were some minor revisions made to these work plans based on comments that were made by the council during the discussion. Kind of go through, and we can go through the numbers in a minute, but prior to the conclusion of that work session, the council members individually had an opportunity to suggest other action steps or priorities that they would like for the council to consider implementing in the 2-year period, which was 2006 and 2007. Those areas are noted in the agenda packet. Just touch on them briefly. One was protection of the environment, including stormwater management, public safety, a plan to address and prevent drug usage, codification of standards regarding non-English language publications, pedestrian safety, improved traffic flow in the Takoma Junction area, sidewalk construction in the area of schools, additional parking for both the community center area as well as Old Town, funding for operation of a skate park, safety near the metro, including implementation of a C-Safe-like model, youth development, and creation of an affordable housing plan. In preparation for tonight's discussion, what the staff has done is, and as promised, was to go through the work plan that had originally been proposed by staff in those 5 policy areas I just mentioned, and to try to pull out each of the action steps and to give you some idea of what the fiscal impact is associated with those items. If you go right behind the blue sheet, there is a kind of a table entitled Proposed Council Priorities for 2006-2007, Required Resources for Implementation, and this refers to the work plan that was presented by staff on January 30th. It's certainly not each and every action step. What I tried to do was sort of capture the major areas that were included in that proposed work plan and to give the council some idea of the cost associated with each of those items. In the notes section, what I've tried to indicate is if it was a continuation of a program that is already in place, is to note that accordingly. An example of that would be the tenant capacity building program and the housing tax credit program. Those are things, as the council is aware, that are already in place, so that it was really not kind of new funding, if you will, but a continuation of what you are already paying for. In other cases, certain items, and there's very few of these, but these were already items that the council has programmed using its community development block grant funds. So those are things that you've already sort of committed to doing, and that funding is already allocated. That would include the Halton Lane streetscape under the New Hampshire Avenue redevelopment, as well as the Maple Avenue streetscape under the development section. The majority of the other items that are noted are basically items for which the city would be making a new financial commitment of resources. And obviously, in the absence of perhaps any change in existing scope of services, we'll need to sort out the impact as part of the FY07 budget process, but there is always the possibility that the addition of these items and a new focus on these areas could result in a change in the city's tax rate. I'm not saying that definitively. We're still working through the numbers for my proposed FY07 budget, but I feel like that does need to be noted as you proceed with your discussion. As we talked about on January 30th, the 5 policy areas that staff had brought to the council's attention for consideration would require a major focus of both staff resources as well as fiscal resources. If you can recall the sheets that we had stuck up along the walls, each of these items on the spreadsheet is sort of a compression of those things, but there's a lot of different steps associated with each and every one of them. So I guess I did want to just reiterate the comment I had made on the 30th as well as on the blue agenda cover sheet, that whatever group of items the council chooses to focus on, it is going to become a major focus of the staff's efforts. It's going to limit our ability to basically act on other major policy areas without the council revisiting these items. And certainly in some cases, there are fiscal resources associated with them. And if the council, for whatever reason, is not comfortable or does not feel it's appropriate to commit those resources to the items that are before you this evening, it would probably be very difficult for us to make the progress that we had envisioned when we put this work plan together. With that, I guess to kind of, given the lateness of the hour, is just to kind of go through perhaps first the fiscal impact section that's associated with the 5 policy areas that staff had proposed, and to see if there's any questions or comments that the council has.
I have a question about the additional code enforcement officer. If you could just remind me the basis for this. It concerns me a little bit because the code enforcement department is one that we recently turned over inspections to the county for, and I would like to maintain that savings.
Sure. Let me clarify. What was turned over to the county is actually the inspection of the rental housing properties in the city, or the rental housing units. The city's property maintenance code is basically still under the jurisdiction of the city, and those are the type of items that our existing code enforcement officer, who is Marjorie, who many of you know, addresses. Those would be things such as trash and debris that are left in people's yards, weeds. Sarah's anything? Those are some of the major ones that you tend to hear about.
Those are the primary ones, abandoned vehicles.
Could you, if you're going to, could you come up to the table?
Yeah, I think what Sarah was saying was abandoned vehicles, as I mentioned, weeds, trash and debris. They're generally fairly egregious items that I guess would be of concerns to the surrounding neighbors. I think as some of you know who have basically had constituents either report code enforcement concerns or have reported them yourself, you've got one person basically trying to cover the entire city. I would say that is challenging already in terms of our ability to turn things around in a timely fashion that meets the needs of some of our residents. I think particularly in the area along New Hampshire Avenue, those are areas, quite frankly, and Councilmember Berry and I have discussed this, that probably need much more targeted enforcement than we've been able to do now. Just due to the age of the housing stock in that area and other factors, we've really had periodic requests from neighbors to basically almost do a monthly sweep, if you will, and that's not something that we've been able to accomplish. I think the issue of code enforcement along New Hampshire Avenue, and Councilmember Berry can correct me if I misspeak, but it has come up in every neighborhood meeting in his ward that I have ever attended. I think as a compromise, what we've agreed to try to do is to maybe go through quarterly through certain areas. That's been our goal. I think that has been challenging as well, but certainly the need of the residents in those areas is much higher than doing that. I would say they really want a much more constant presence.
Thank you.
Bruce?
Sarah, is abandoned properties or seemingly abandoned properties something that also comes up fairly regularly, just because that's my experience with when I hear about things?
Correct. We end up with a lot of...
Because you talked about abandoned vehicles, but I'm thinking
we get
the whole property.
We get abandoned vehicles. We get properties that are abandoned or appear to be abandoned. We're also getting an increasing number of complaints regarding the condition of commercial properties in the community. And all of those inspections or those complaints are time-consuming. It's just not a matter of going out and going, yep, that's a problem. You go out, meet with the property owner, there's required correspondence and just the whole abatement process. So it has become more of an issue in terms of the increased number of complaints that we're receiving. And in your ward, there are a number of abandoned properties.
Which defies rational thought, but...
Well, it does, I know. Why would you not want to live in...
Why would you not want to...
Or sell...
Either sell it for a nice chunk of money, or have somebody in there paying rent, and if you only own one, you're not under rent control.
True, very true.
Any number of ways to... Yes. but then I guess that goes along with any number of irrational things that happen in the world these days.
I have another question about the development item. Consulting services, I'm hoping is to include the transportation analysis needed around the metro.
Yes, this was truthfully kind of a best guess kind of number. When we talked on January 30th, the council, and I think Sarah and I concur, was much more comfortable with the thought of using consultants on an as-needed basis where you could basically draw upon the expertise of a particular firm or individual as we dealt with different types of issues rather than hiring a staff person. So I think our thought, Councilmember Austin Lane, in answer to your specific question, is that the area around the metro would certainly be one of the areas that we would envision perhaps using consulting services for. Candidly, whether $100,000 is the right figure or not is really a guess. What we tried to do basically is originally we had talked about a staff person. If you start adding in, actual salary costs for a year and benefits, it's, not quite that figure, but somewhat approaching it. Certainly that could be reduced depending on, I guess, the council's expectations of what the issues are that you might feel you're going to be dealing with next fiscal year.
Okay. Would it include legal expenses for development projects?
We, obviously, that's really generally paid more out of the city's legal budget, even if it's a specialized consultant, because we kind of capture all our legal costs there typically, except for the community center where it's booked against the project. I really am putting together this number, Councilmember Austin, and really viewed it as more kind of probably planning consultants, traffic experts, things of that nature.
Does it include, I know that you and I have talked about the Park Avenue situation where it looks like we do need to hire a design firm that will go in and provide the neighbors with proposals for how to solve that concrete jungle problem.
I didn't have that specifically in mind. I think the issues we had talked to with the council about before were the metro development, Washington Adventist Hospital, I'm drawing a blank on which other ones, and just any other type of development issues that might arise.
Okay, thanks.
Terry.
Thank you, Mayor Porter. I appreciate the work that went into this. As I had listed a number of things that I felt were priorities that basically got answered in the back sheet without a budget allocated to it, I would just like to review the one on the plan to address and prevent drug usage. The staff comments say that the police department recognizes that drug enforcement is an integral part of its mission, and until such time as the vacant vice, narcotics, and intelligence position can be filled, the existing criminal investigation division staff is responsible for investigating narcotics violations, and that the staff has drawn on the assistance of other jurisdictions in investigating these matters. The perception of many residents of Ward 4 is that the city has done very little to enforce the drug sales laws within our neighborhood. And I would like to, Ms. Matthews, I would appreciate getting a report from our police department on drug sale or drug investigations, arrests, and convictions in the Ward 4 area for a period of the last couple of years.
Sure. I'd be happy to follow up with Chief Kramer on that, Councilmember Siemens.
I appreciate that. And then the staff comments goes on to say the issue of drug usage and prevention is a complex matter which is more appropriately addressed by social service agencies at other levels of government. Any involvement by the city would constitute a duplication of services. I will take this as a license to reach out to those other levels of government to address those issues here in Ward 4. But I would like to, quite often when I talk with other levels of government about assisting in Takoma Park issues, they say that they need to be invited in by the Takoma Park government to do those things. So I'd like to work closely with you on that to make sure that they do have their full reins of being able to assist us in this area.
Be happy to do that.
It seems that we've moved beyond the 5 areas into the multiple areas at the bottom, and I know that the one that I care the most about and have been in meetings with the mayor about most recently is setting up the crime prevention model around the metro. Just to update my colleagues, a group of residents met this past week and decided to come up with a name and push this forward, and are looking to get funding in the coming fiscal year to institute the program, and I think that's appropriate. The name of the group is Safe Takoma, and it's a crime prevention collaborative initiative that uses much of what's been learned in the Crossroads area. What I have said in the public meeting and would like my colleagues to be aware of is that there's two prongs to us setting up a program in the metro area. One is that we have to stabilize the C-SAFE model in the Crossroads area in order to make sure that we're not taking away resources from that program in order to start a second one. I think that the two programs are different, but they need to be tailored to the community, and the proposed budget for 1 year of getting the one around the metro is $150,000. I have a feeling that we will probably only get the D.C. government to take an interest in providing matching money, and it does look like things are moving in that direction. So I know that in last year's budget discussions, we had a figure of $25,000 bandied about, and I think that this year what we'll be talking about is half of the program cost at $75,000. In order to, in my discussions with the police chief, it seems that in order to stabilize the C-SAFE program in the Crossroads, and certainly Councilmember Berry could speak more pertinently to this, but there needs to be some city guarantee of the salaries for the people who work in that program. And I would be interested in supporting that, the 6-month period of guaranteeing salaries so that there is not this gap in funding because of grant cycles. I think it's important for us to keep the ground that we've gained there and then some. And what would be nice if we could have some economies of scale by having 2 programs functioning and possibly some enhancement to both areas because of that. What the community group is doing is branching out now to make sure all of the neighborhood associations are covered in, that's already been done on the Maryland side. They're doing it now with the ANCs and in 4B and with the Tacoma DC Neighborhood Association. I've had conversations with the officials over there, and if residents say this is what they want, I think that it will be a very innovative program for our area, like it has been in the Crossroads. An additional next step that's needed is for us to define the area that the C-SAFE program around the metro, well, actually the name is Safe Tacoma, so the Safe Tacoma program would encompass, and it behooves us to include the Maple Avenue corridor all the way down to Sligo Creek Parkway, which would be Ward 1 and Ward 4, as well as the Tacoma DC neighborhood. So this is, not to launch a specific discussion of this, but really just to update the council about the numbers that we're talking about this year and the intensity with which I see the community's support for this program, and I hope that it will get your support by the time we finalize a budget.
I would just like to counsel my colleagues to try to avoid the temptation to boil the ocean and to be all things to all people, or in our case, more and more and more things to all the people. And we have 4 very important areas of focus. that we have developed. And I think it's very important that we are able to show the community some progress in all of those 4 areas rather than to have a long laundry list of things in which at the end we may have little to show. And I really think that we need to avoid that temptation and try to stick to our knitting and make sure that we have made substantial progress in those 4 areas. 5. Which was
The New Hampshire Avenue has been
5 areas.
separated out of the development.
All right.
But they're-
We're on a slow rolling boil. But we 40, I said.
I'd like to second Doug's comments. And I have a question, I think probably for the mayor, and then some comments. So my question, being new to the council, is that I see a lot of numbers attached to this spreadsheet, and my understanding based on previous conversations is this isn't really the budget setting time. We're just trying to get a sense of what some of these costs might be. So I don't have to panic when I see numbers later on that have just a couple small projects in them, because the discussion is open around what projects and how much they cost. Is that correct?
That might be addressed better to the city manager, who is actually in the process of preparing the budget right now.
Yeah, we are hard at work on the budget, and it's scheduled to be delivered to the council. I believe it's, I'm making a presentation of my proposed budget. It's April 10th, I believe. We really are in a position this week that I need to get the numbers to stop moving so we can sort of look at the revenues that we're projecting to come in versus the desired expenditure. So I think the more direction that the council can give me this evening would be appreciated, because in the absence of that direction, quite frankly, it is my proposed budget ultimately, but I'd obviously like it to reflect what your priorities are for the community. In the absence of that direction, quite frankly, I'll just have to use my own judgment, acting independently based on what I've heard and my sense of where the majority of the council is at. I don't know, Councilmember Clay, if that answers your question or not, but that's sort of the way the process is working.
I would note that according to my calculations, the FY07 costs of the items on your list, the 5 priority area items on the list, taking out the 4 that you mentioned as being currently ongoing costs, as well as taking out the Carroll Avenue streetscape, which I think it looks like we wouldn't do unless we got outside funding.
That has been the discussion today.
Right.
Is I had sent the council a notification about community legacy funding, so my assumption is that would be a grant-funded project.
So if you remove those 5 under the assumption that we would have to pay for them, but the money would either come from elsewhere or is already in the budget, I come up with $633,000 total for the remainder of the items in the FY07 budget column.
Yeah, I might just note that probably the gym falls into that. Obviously, the conceptual design for the gym, my expectation was that obviously the city would be paying for that, potentially perhaps with its own funds or with any of the contributions that are already have been committed.
But the final design, you're saying, would be another area that we would
right.
take
I mean,
from funds coming in.
we had talked about, at this point, as I indicated on the 30th, the staff's assumption had to be that we were moving forward and trying to identify the steps associated with that. At such time as the conceptual design, including cost estimates, is completed, the council can review that information, and you may choose to go forward or you may choose not to go forward. So that $300,000, which is basically sort of 10% of, at this point, the number we've been bandying about is the cost of the gym and the parking, and associated utility locations, if that becomes necessary. Typically, you see design costs running anywhere from 5 to 10% of a project cost. So that's where that number came from.
So if we were to assume that that's coming out of other funding also, then that takes it down to $333,000 total, would be the amount of new costs for the budget, for the FY07 budget for the 5 items that you've delineated. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, the largest other chunk besides the ones we just spoke about, Carroll Avenue, as well as gym expenses, is the consulting services for development. As I mentioned at the beginning of this discussion, that's just sort of a best guess type of thing. The council ultimately controls how and when you use consultants, and certainly the less that we rely on that expertise, that number can be reduced.
Okay.
Okay, so I have some comments then.
Okay, go ahead.
I'm really happy with the write-up on the protection of the environment and stormwater management, and there aren't costs associated with it at this point, but I would really like to see the Committee on the Environment look at our environmental policies and see what we could do. The same with public safety, and I'm not sure, what the costs are that are associated with that, but my understanding is that we have full funding for the police department if we could only find all of the officers to take those jobs. One of my concerns is, like, when I read the public safety piece and I see there's just one project listed here, Glenside Avenue in Ward 6, plus the speed camera, which would be all over the city. And I want to make sure that when we're talking about pedestrian safety as a priority, that we're talking about pedestrian safety all over the city.
May I make a comment?
Yes.
If I could just make a comment. When this was specifically discussed by the council, in the comments that I subsequently received, the Glenside Avenue project was specifically mentioned. I had my budget meeting with the Public Works Director earlier today. At least this point, what my direction to her was to basically include the cost of the Glenside Avenue project in Ward 6 and try to provide some additional funding for projects not yet identified in other parts of the city.
Okay. Regarding the safety near the metro and the C-Safe model, that's kind of another thing in terms of broad safety issues across the city. I know that my ward and Bruce's ward have had some hotspot issues recently. I think maybe historically there's been more a hotspot issue in the crossroads and then developing in the metro, but it seems to just really be a big issue, particularly along the border areas. And I think maybe we should take a more comprehensive look at how we're going to cope with this issue. Regarding youth development, I wanted to clarify that I wasn't suggesting that a committee of young people do a comprehensive evaluation of all of the youth services. I was suggesting that we could do kind of a youth council. I've gotten a lot of feedback that I guess that's been tried before. I would be interested in that, but I have to say that this being my first year on the council, I'm not ready to make a commitment to do that, and I don't want to make a commitment to spearhead that until I knew that I had the energy and the resources to follow through, and I don't think that's the state that I'm in this year. And so given that, and that I don't think there are other folks who want to lead it but who might want to do it together, I would ask that we withdraw that for the year.
Which one?
Doing a youth council. I still want to support the recreation director's evaluation of services, but yeah, in terms of doing kind of a bigger project, that's a bit much. And my last comment is that we have affordable housing as our #1 goal, which is great, and we have $95,000 down that money goes to some very good things, but it doesn't really create long-term affordability in the community. And as Mark pointed out, that affordable housing is a moral issue, and given that it's a moral issue, I'm sure that there would be a great benefit to the city committing resources to developing long-term affordable housing, and I would like to see us try to identify mechanisms to do that, whether they be directly out of our budget or other ideas that we've talked about different funding mechanisms that, like a tax on real estate transfer tax, or, I don't know if that's feasible or not, but just that we find some different ways so that we have another mechanism for affordable housing development in the city. And I know with Joy and Terry and the mayor, we have talked some with some folks from the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments about identifying other tools, and we'll have some upcoming workshops in the city to help us with that.
And my intention, when we're talking about rent stabilization and overall affordable housing, was that at some point we would talk about the affordable housing plan itself and any modifications we wanted to make to it. And so that is on the list of things that I'm intending to bring up. I wanted to just add one thing in the discussion of speed cameras. We got a presentation at MML last week on the status of speed cameras, and it sounds like the county is working fairly slowly. They anticipate they're not going to be ready to roll out until this fall. But I also talked to the mayor of Rockville, and Rockville is moving a little bit more swiftly. It might make sense for us to get a presentation not just from the county, which seems to be moving at a more glacial pace, but also from Rockville, which is moving more rapidly. And according to the mayor of Rockville, they've done a fair amount of work on this, and we could avoid reinventing the wheel by piggybacking on some of the work that they've already done. And being a much larger jurisdiction, they may have more clout in terms of going out into the marketplace. So I think that might be something that for us to take a look at in addition to looking at what the county's doing.
I'd appreciate the city manager taking a look at what City of Rockville is doing as well. I think what was clear in our MML discussion with county council members is there are a variety of reasons why the county may not take this up anytime soon. So cities are certainly within our purview to do that, and I see no reason to wait, given that we've already had one offer of a no-cost pilot program where the speed cameras would be put in place, and we would not have to pay for those startup costs. So I would really like to see us look at a request for proposals as soon as we can.
Okay, are there other comments? If I'm understanding where the council is, does the council wish, let me put this in the form of a question, does the council wish to direct the city manager to take the action steps that are listed in the first page behind the blue sheet? This is basically a costing out of the things that we discussed at our first discussion. Are people comfortable with that? My calculation is, something like $300,000 in new city money, and other monies to come from other locations, and also some monies that are already ongoing funded categories of the budget.
Yes.
I think that we would be remiss in not addressing the public safety aspects.
I'm trying to do this in pieces, so I can make sure that my understanding is what the city manager needs is she needs the council's agreement to go forward with these issues that are on the first section, and then I think we can talk about sort of specific things following up. If things that were specifically mentioned, I'm going to take that the lack of anything to the contrary as being a yes. The council wishes to direct the city manager to do that. And then in terms of the specific items, a couple of things have been especially mentioned. Terry asked for a specific piece of information on the drug thing. I asked to add some information, as did Councilmember Austin Lane, on the speed cameras. My understanding is that Joy put something on the table that she wants to bring up during the budget discussion if it's not already in the budget. Am I correct in saying that in the safety
I would appreciate if the safety near the metro was anticipated instead of kind of late-breaking news in the budget discussions. Okay. So I think that would make sense. If this is going to be funded, I would guess that we would have that partner within the next 2 to 3 months. So instead of having this come up very late, and I think it would make sense for it to be anticipated. And I believe that there is enough support on the council to see it through.
I would be in favor of putting in the budget if we had a partner. I'm not sure the timing is going to be a little awkward in terms of the budget. But I think this is something that the partnership is the critical piece of it, and we should do what we can, and I know people are doing a lot of work to try and encourage that partnership. Yeah.
Thank you. I think Councilmember Austin Lane's point is good, though, that we should anticipate the possibility that we want to do this, and it would be helpful to have the numbers in front of us, and since we know that's going to come up, it would be nice to give you the leisure of time to prepare those numbers for us, and also to do whatever checking with the state and with the District of Columbia to see what their level of participation would be. I know that when we spoke with the state last summer, Mayor Porter and I spoke with the state CSAFE people that they were very interested at that time, and in fact were willing to start commit some startup money at that time if we were ready to commit to actually follow through with our funding support later. We weren't able to do that at that time, but it would be nice to see where they stand on it now.
And we must also be careful not to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Right now, the Crossroads CSAFE program is 100% grant funded, and those grants are always, a little shaky. We've lost some very key people because we weren't able to guarantee them from one year to the other. And even though the Washington, D.C. Border area certainly has very compelling needs, I wouldn't want to see the CSAFE program jeopardized in order to fund a new endeavor on the other side of town. So we have to be sure that there is money to be able to provide for both if that money needs to come from the city funds.
I think you make another good point, bringing up the fact that we do have experience with CSAFE in the Takoma-Langley Crossroads area, that it might be helpful for this council to look at the benefits that have been derived from that program in the Takoma-Langley Crossroads area as we consider whether to spend additional money for the Ward 1 and Ward 4 areas.
Can I just clarify? So this anticipation would really entail the $75,000 that the city would have to match one other partner. And I would think that would be the strongest basis for us to initiate this Safe Tacoma proposal around the metro. And then, in addition to that $75,000 anticipated funding, we would need to guarantee for 6 months the CSAFE program in the Takoma-Langley Crossroads. And that money may or may not be necessarily used, but it would need to be there in order to stabilize the program.
I think it's worth, as I said, allowing in the budget for a potential CSAFE model. But again, I would say, Safe Tacoma around the metro, again, I would say that I think my support would be contingent on our finding a partner. I think it's the critical piece is the partnership. And I really don't want us to signal to any potential partners that if they don't step up, that we'll just take care of it. So I really think it has to be contingent. Okay. And I'm assuming on the other items that the council is comfortable with the direction that staff has proposed in their comments on these issues. All right. I'm taking that lack of somebody saying something else that we are in fact comfortable with the staff direction.
I said everything I had to say, so if I didn't make a comment on it, I was thrilled with it.
Okay. I do appreciate that. Obviously, there was a lot of work that went into developing and fleshing out the priorities. There's a lot of work that obviously went into coming up with the details, including the cost estimates. And I do appreciate the thoughtfulness that went into the responses to these various additional items. So I think the reason that the council isn't sitting up here arguing is because there's a lot of sort of common sense and rationality into these responses, and I think that sounds like a good direction.
I just make one comment or just clarification. Obviously, the items that we're talking about, as the mayor pointed out, represent several $100,000 of essentially new investment. We're still working on the revenue numbers, and I know this is, I'm asking you to kind of give me some sense of where you're at in the absence of seeing that, but I think it's entirely conceivable that the results of going in these new directions may be difficult to do within the existing tax rate. Not saying that definitively. We're still working through the numbers, but I guess I just want to put that out there and make sure that if there is a impact on the tax rate from moving forward in this direction, is this council inclined to still move in this direction? We'll obviously do our best to make sure we can accommodate the cost of any new initiatives to the extent we can without impacting the tax rate. But I'm not a magician. There's only so much you can do with the numbers. And I do just want to throw that out there. That's certainly something the council can defer any decision on until the budget's presented and you have the whole picture. But I do want to just leave that cautionary note as we move forward.
And you're talking about the constant yield tax rate?
We do have the constant yield tax rate. I don't remember the number off the top of my head, Councilmember Siemens, but that's 6 or 7 cents below the existing tax rate of 63 cents. So obviously we had some discussion about this last year. I don't think there's any way that the city can continue to function even with its present level of services if this tax rate is going to be reduced to the constant yield. I just don't see any way that's feasible given the magnitude of that loss of revenue.
If I can just get a clarification. Are you talking about the increase in the tax rate for these items being on top of the current rate, or are you talking about in addition to whatever rate your figures end up at that might well be below the current rate, and that this would bring anything else exclusive of this? When you combine the two, it would bring it closer back to where the tax rate is for the current year.
Must be after 10 o'clock.
It is. I'm not sure my ability. Let me put it another way.
Let me put it another way. Exclusive of this, what we've just been talking about, are you anticipating presenting to us a tax rate lower than the current rate? I'm not talking constant yield.
Truthfully, it's way too early to tell. I mean, like I said, I still had my meeting with the Public Works Director today. There's still some work on the CIP. I guess if I could, Councilmember Williams asked the question another way. If given a choice, what is the higher priority for the council? Is it to leave the tax rate unchanged, or does the council feel strongly enough that should it be necessary, and I'm not saying that it is, would you be willing to deviate from the current tax rate if necessary to make an investment in these initiatives that you've discussed this evening?
That's not the question I want to answer. Because my answer depends on where the rate is without this, whether it's lower than the current rate or the same as the current rate. And I guess so given that, my answer would be, if you were to come in with a budget that said we're currently in 06. The 06 rate is 63 cents. My proposed 07 rate is 63 cents, and if you want to do these priorities on top of that, it would go up. My reaction would be, no, I don't want to go there.
Okay. Obviously, we don't have a complete picture. What I guess my commitment to the council will be that, the first level is to protect the existing level of service. I'm hearing, understandably, some concern about the tax rate. If it looks like the initiatives that you supported this evening cannot be accommodated within the existing tax rate, what you will get is a budget that basically presents some options of what you can, what is the fiscal impact if you move forward. That's probably the best we're going to be able to come up with tonight in the absence of having the actual numbers in front of you, and that's still going to be a couple weeks.
So then the numbers assume that everything that we've done before us is sort of set in stone. And I guess a question that I would ask, if we could look at, is are there things that might be a lesser priority that we're currently doing than something that we've identified here, and so we might want to make a trade-off there? And,
sure.
And when will we get to that kind of question in the process?
That's generally during the budget work sessions. If there are items that, in my judgment, Councilmember Clay, are services that are discretionary, are not cost-effective, is generally, probably what I would think of. Then my proposed budget may come before you with the elimination of services that don't appear to be cost-effective or could be addressed in another way. I think the council, since you're the policy-making body, that through the budget process actually determines service delivery in this community, you can always make those trade-offs as you go through the budget process.
I think I would second Bruce's comments with a sort of a proviso. I think it's important that you give us a budget that keeps the tax rate constant. If you don't feel that that would fit all the new initiatives that we're talking about, and I would agree with Colleen that one of the options, obviously, and one that we've used many times in the past, is when we add new things that are higher priorities, we eliminate things which, while they may be good things to do, are lower on our priority list. That's sort of how we've done in the past, particularly when we're talking about staffing. That we look at adding things back into the budget, both in terms of what the impact on the tax rate would be, but also in terms of what kinds of trade-offs there could be in terms of services. So I think starting at a base level of not constant yield, I don't think constant yield assumes that there's no increases in the costs of anything, which means that if you stay with constant yield, you're decreasing services year by year. And I think that a sort of a rule of thumb, if we use as sort of a measure the same tax rate, which does give you some increase because of the increase in the base, if we use that and then see what can be put in and what can be substituted for things that are already there, I think that that's a good way to look at it.
I'm momentarily agnostic on the tax rate, because I really do think it comes down to what level of services we want to provide. But there are a couple of things that I'd like to say. One is that having done this now for 19 years, it's something like every time something new's on the table, then the impression is that staff is doing everything they could possibly be doing, and therefore if you ask something new, this must require a greater expenditure. And many of the things that were new are no longer done, but it always seems that it's never like, well, you're not doing this now, and so but now you're asking us to do this, so there's a balance. And I would really like to think that we're looking at whether, not just is this additional, but how does the workload and the departments really fit, and can some of these things, do they really require more money, or can they be done within what the resources we have by shifting things around? And maybe it's reprioritizing, but maybe it's just looking at the jobs people are doing, and that there actually is time to squeeze in a couple of hours a week on this project or that project. The other thing on the police department, I would really, this is the most frustrating thing in the world. Maybe we should all shake our heads on this. If, for example, we didn't get the grant to have a partner for the CSAFE, I would like to think that we would look at the way we program things for the police and what we do to maximize, effectiveness in areas that are hotspots. I mean, it just can't simply be that you've got 41 patrol officers, they do what they're going to do, and if you want to do anything extra, then we're just incapable of thinking about how to redeploy our resources in an effective way. It must require more. I mean, if we don't get the partner for the grant, I'd like to think that the department's going to say, we've got, this issue in the metro area, we've got this issue in some of these other wards. There's got to be a way for us to design shifts, to design, the way we roll people out within the current resources that provides more concentrated help where the help is needed. So I guess what I'm asking is that we expect out of all departments a certain amount of flexibility and willingness to say, how do you meet the needs, and if there's not all the money in the world there, can we be creative about how to go out and address some of this? I think it would be really a disservice to people to say, oh, we didn't get the CSAFE grant, so nothing changes in all that. That can't be.
Well, and I didn't make that comment. I think I can only speak for my.
I'm just concerned that we go that way.
All I can speak for, I guess, is kind of my tenure when we have positions that come open. And those of you who've been on the council, obviously Councilmember Clay wasn't part of this process, but we look at, is there a different way of doing things? And an example that comes to mind is the city had created a procurement officer position a number of years ago. The position became vacant a couple months after I started. We sort of looked at our existing staff, whether people were utilized to capacity, and chose not to fill that position and coupled those duties, in another manner with another position. There was another position that we, a couple positions we have done that with. So I think that's just part of a way that, at least I like to think that we do business. And certainly it's always a process of looking at issues as they arise, and is there a different way of doing things, and, trying to keep, staffing levels as static as you can. And I remember, I think you're asking me that question when I came here to interview, as a matter of fact. Having said that, I do think there is a point where you can't kid yourselves, and you can only keep trying to take on more and more and more. And if you don't add resources, you're not going to do it very well. And I will say there have been times during my 20 months or so with this community, and I think we're at that point now, and it's kind of come at peaks and valleys, where we're trying to juggle so many things that, quite frankly, I'm just waiting for all the balls to start falling out of the air. I think this community is very blessed to have a great staff that is willing to put in a lot of hours. I think if you look at many of your emails, whether it's the city clerk sending an email to a constituent from home at 10 o'clock at night. I know I've seen emails from Suzanne at 5:30 in the morning. I've been doing this for 20 years, and quite frankly, you don't see a lot of staffs that will do that. And I personally appreciate the fact that they're willing to, but I do think there's a point in time which you cannot continue to have people operate like that. They just burn out, or truthfully, they're so tired they make mistakes and things start falling through the cracks. So I think that's just a constant process that I have to go through as a manager, trying to evaluate, is there a better way of doing things? And I think when we hit the wall, if you will, and we can't take on any more and do it in a quality way, I think I owe it to you to tell you that as well.
I appreciate that, and I don't expect people to work at 4:30 in the morning to do this. I guess I'm concerned that everything not become an add-on, and that we really, it just seems that it's not the direction we necessarily would like to go in. And I guess the other thing that concerns me is I don't see a big fight over the rebate in this. And I just continue to be mystified, particularly at the public works issue. And that the exchange of emails today that we talked about, when we talked about the lighting situation in the city, I mean, it brought to mind that the entire rebate, I think, from Montgomery County for our public works department is equal to the electric bill that we pay Pepco.
Yeah.
That means no money for roads, no money for anything else we do. We get enough money for Pepco and Pepco, and it's a couple $100,000. And I don't know why this isn't the year we don't say to Montgomery County, if you think you can do all the roads, all the parks, and everything else Public Works does for $240,000, knock yourself out. But they'd still have the Pepco bill to pay, because it would be their bill then, and then they'd have to do everything else. And I feel like, if the money is really, if it's an issue, which it is, we ought to be beating on the county over some of these rebates.
I think we are going to be doing that, but I think a lot of what we have to do is political work, which is something that we as council members have to do rather than expecting the staff to do.
But what's more political than saying you take over Public Works for $240,000 a year because we can't do it for $240,000, knock yourselves out? That to me seems to be pretty political. Confront the county with, this is what you give us for everything we do, list it out, and say, do you want to do it? Here's the electric bill. Have fun. I mean, that to me is political.
Right, but that's what
nice, but it's political.
Well, the point that I'm trying to make is I think a lot of the leverage that we've got on the rebate issue is something that the council's going to have to work on rather than expecting the staff to do. I mean, the staff, I think, is providing support, and I think that's an important aspect of it. But really, a lot of it is going to be ours, because much of it is something that we're going to have to deal with in our dealings with the county. Terry.
Thank you. I think Mark's points about these projects is good in that it's helpful to see projects costed out like this for these new projects, but it's also helpful to be able to look at ongoing projects in the same way so that we can see, make those decisions at budget time on which ones have the higher priority. Then we can remove existing projects if necessary to fit in the new projects.
If I might, one of the struggles that I've always had in my position, and part of it is just because I have a strange position, is that I work on crisis projects. And so some of the things that are more ongoing, that are things that I am committed to doing, often get put, further back on my desk. And that's something that I do regret, because sometimes real progress can be made on those kinds of things if there's a little more attention to it. I do appreciate that I think there's been more attention. I really appreciate Barb's leadership on, keeping some of those things going and saying these things remain priorities. But it does take a lot of attention, I think, to try to figure out how to manage those things. As we go through the budget process, again, the more direction that you all can give about your priorities is really helpful for us as we try to make those decisions, which things are more important.
And I guess to follow up on Councilmember Seaman's comment, I'm sure that each of you may have existing programs that perhaps you have, a particular interest in maybe having some discussion about during the budget process, or you'd like, perhaps a little bit more detail about those particular service areas. If there are some that you have some interest in, if you could just shoot me an email letting me know what those are, and that way we can, start gearing up and pulling some information together in preparation for the budget process. Obviously, our goal as a staff is to make sure that you have the information that you need to make the kind of policy decisions that you're charged with making.
I want to second the comments that were made about the staff. I do think that we have a staff that works very hard, and I'm always getting things sent to me by email after supposed office hours from many members of the staff, and I appreciate it that our staff is focused on doing the best job they can and not simply in putting in a certain number of hours at their desk every day, and that goes for all the staff that I work with, and I very much appreciate that. And we have a very demanding community. They do pay high taxes, and they do demand good quality services. And I think that we have a very good staff that is dedicated to providing a very high quality level of service. So thank you all. Okay. If there's nothing else, we're adjourned.